Greetings! This is Griff Ruby with yet another Isaac Asimov story in its original publication and the way it originally made its public. Now you can see from the title of this magazine it says fantasy, and so it is. In the beginning, he wanted to write science fiction stories, and he wanted to write them for John Campbell, who he had visited in his offices with his very first written story, Cosmic Corkscrew, and Campbell sat him down, gave him lots and lots of helpful advice, and would continue looking at his stuff and helping him figure out what needs to be done to make it better and better until he finally was able to get a story good enough to sell. And that first one was Trends, which appeared on the pages of the July 1939 Astounding Science Fiction. And from there on, the rest is history, Nightfall, Robots, Foundation, and so forth. So that was a very good relation there. However, John Campbell had another magazine called The Unknown. And this, unlike Astounding Science Fiction, was not hard science fiction, but fantasy. And apparently, fantasy is a little harder to judge because it doesn't have the same very harsh, strict rules of science fiction. It's much more whimsical. But that doesn't mean there isn't some kind of a discipline to it that may just be kind of difficult to describe or define. And he wanted to get into that magazine too, but he was making attempt after attempt. One of his earliest attempts that I know of, the earliest he lists, was called Life Before Birth. He couldn't sell it. He couldn't sell it anywhere else. That story is gone. Another attempt was called The Oak. He remembers vaguely that this involved some sort of oak tree that could tell fortunes or something in the way it rustled its leaves. Rather interesting concept, I should think, but maybe there was nothing else much interesting to the story. And then there was another one called Masks. That too was intended for the unknown, and didn't sell there or anywhere else, and is lost. And in fact, since other stories coming somewhat later have since turned up, Masks has the distinction of being the last story he would write in those early years that is now lost. So, those were failures. However, he was able to get a couple half successes. His friend, Fred Pohl, had written a fantasy story called The Little Man on the Subway. But there were just things in it he just couldn't quite get to gel as he wrote it. So he handed it over to Isaac Asimov, who looked at what he did, improved it, cleaned it up, tightened it, made it better, added his stuff to it, made it really a good story, or well, it's a lot more of a story. He then handed it back to Fred Pohl, who, I don't know, maybe tweaked it a bit further or not, I don't know, who then tried to play the agent and see if he could sell that story somewhere. It took a long time. This story was written between the two of them. We're talking late 1940, early 1941 time frame. It took until early 1950 when finally this very tiny fantasy magazine called Fantasy Book would finally run the story. So, but it didn't sell to Unknown. It didn't sell to very few markets there were at the time. I think Weird Tales may have been the only other one. So, but finally this. Now, Fantasy Book is a very small publication. You'll see it's number 6. In point of fact, there were only 8 issues before this magazine stopped. So, that's not very much. It is, however, the first story on here, and that probably is having an Asimov story, even if it's shared with a James MacCreigh, which was just Fred Pohl's pseudonym, or one of his pseudonyms, as a co-author. So at least he gets into a fantasy story as half of a collaboration. So there is no artwork. There are no publisher's blurbs associated with this thing. And in point of fact, going through it, I only observed one very small difference, and that is in the very first paragraph. It starts off with, after all, subway stations, as Colonel Stoopnagel would say, are places where people get out at. So when no one left first car at Atlantic Avenue Station, conductor Cullen of the IRT began to get worried. Well, they pulled out that bit about Colonel Stoopnagle. It's just now, after all, subway stations are places where people get out at. I don't know why Stoopnagle was in there in the first place, and I also don't know why that, out of anything else we could have looked at, is the one thing that got pulled out. That seems to be the only change. There are some references that are very dated. I think probably the most interesting one that I thought is how could a train, Flatbush Avenue apparently was the last stop. There's nothing but a bumper and then there's no tunnel beyond it. It all ends right there. And yet somehow on this mysterious ride it has continued on beyond Flatbush Avenue. And so there's no further tunnel. There's a bumper stop to prevent eccentric motormen from trying to bore one. This is absurd. Even the New Deal couldn't have done it. Wow. Yeah, we all remember Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal and all that. Yeah, it did some interesting things, Golden Gate Bridge, Hoover Dam, and so forth. So it was kind of an interesting thing, all said and told. But no, even the New Deal couldn't have suddenly put a whole brand new tunnel in there, is what they're saying. Yeah, now that the New Deal is kind of way in the past, it's very much now a historic reference. But it made sense in 1940, 41, and even in early 1950 when this came out, it still made sense. So, what is this story? It's, unfortunately, it's not a terribly interesting story, but it is kind of one of those scenarios where you get in a subway, and somehow, instead of getting to the next subway station or some normal subway station, you suddenly find yourself in some other subterranean place. I don't think it's the only story I've seen where that happens, but it happens here. And actually, first you seem to pass some places that sounded, stations with names like Archangel Road and Seraph Road, and then later on you get to this cavernous-looking place. And this is the last stop, and everybody out. Well, some people got off at the other stations. Anyway, and our Mr. Cullen, who we were introduced at the beginning of the story, meets up with a character named Mr. Crumley. And Mr. Crumley is trying to make himself into a god by working miracles, which apparently he's able to do, I guess. And his goal is to try to make a bunch of believers and maybe also some disciples that will help him make more believers. All he's got to do is whoop-de-doo, magic, do-do-do-do-do, and now you're a believer. Boom! And suddenly Cullen's a believer. Until the very end when he decides to go his own way and he just does it in reverse and Cullen's back to his normal self. An Irish, whatever kind of person. Is a nice description of him I kind of like here, though it describes, I think he was, let's see, where are we? Okay. His theology was weak, but for a mortal to claim godship smacked of heresy, not to say sacrilege and blasphemy, even to him. So he didn't know a lot, but I like the way they put that. The flesh is weak, the spirit is willing, the flesh is weak. His theology was weak. I don't know, kind of had a little capture of that. And basically, he gets in there. Mr. Crumley turns him into a believer, and he's among some of Crumley's disciples who, for some reason, decide to try to have a revolt against Mr. Crumley, but he doesn't want any part of that revolt. Mr. Crumley finally is able to help rescue him from that, but it costs Mr. Crumley so many of his disciples. He loses so much power, he decides to go somewhere else and play around with the chimpanzees, I guess. And he returns back to the original station at Flatbush where all this, jumped off. Because, all it was kind of a neat beginning. For some reason, one single car on a subway people would get on, and nobody gets off. And just station after station, there'd be some people who get on, and nobody gets off. And it just keeps going. Finally, you get to Flatbush, the end of the line. Now everybody has to get off. Nobody gets off. So he gets on there like, come on, you guys, get off. And all of a sudden, the motorman there, not the guy you expect, but some other sort of person, just pushes the little lever, and the car keeps going in a direction where that's not physically possible. And they start going past all these other little subway stations that don't exist. And so that part of it is, I think, kind of neat. And anyway, it didn't come out till 1950, and then he got out. It came there as half of a collaboration. But it's kind of an early attempt at him trying to work with fantasy. So there's not too much to say on that one. Anyway, that was the next story. Thanks for listening.